If you like the video, make sure to like, subscribe, and comment. For more videos like this. What's the most supernatural experience you've ever had? I was spending the night at a friend's house who had a lot of woods on his land. We were probably 14 to 15 or so. We set up a tent back in the woods, maybe a 30-minute walk from his house. We hung out in the tent listening to music on a boombox and bullshitting, smoking cigarettes like true rebels, standard teenager shit. As the sun was going down, we decided we didn't really want to spend the night in the woods and started walking back towards his house. There was still enough light to walk, but it was kind of a hassle. As we were walking and talking, we both went silent mid-sentence. We just started walking quietly for a little bit. Then I say to my buddy, "You feel that?" And he says back, "Yeah, what is that, man?" And we're both looking around. I have this hair-raising feeling like something hostile is watching, but don't hear anything. We start walking just a little bit faster, as there's still a little ways to go. We both have this feeling of dread, and out of nowhere we both ducking stop and end up back to back looking around. My fight or flight response is dialed up to 11, and my brain has chosen fight. My friend yells, "Something is out there. It's coming." My whole body is tensed up and ready to explode. I'm ready to grab and ducking rip apart the next thing that moves in front of me with every fiber of my being. It was such a surreal feeling, like a wild animal wearing my skin. I let out this panicked battle cry because my brain is 100% convinced that I'm about to fight to the death with whatever is in the woods. As soon as I do, we hear something start tearing through the woods away from us, going back the way we came. We both start sprinting through the woods at full throttle. Just running directly through small trees and branches. Neither of us stops until we're inside his house and the back door is closed. We both ran so hard that we almost passed out. It took us a while to catch our breath. We have no idea what it was in the woods. I saw my deceased ex-husband in my kitchen. I was watching TV in my living room, in the middle of the day, and kept hearing this sound, like someone was jiggling their change around. And it was loud, as if it were in the room with me. I paused my TV, yet the sound persisted. So I start to look around the room, and when I got to the kitchen, I saw him standing there. He was looking around, as if taking stock of my apartment. Oh, and he was jiggling change in one hand, while flipping a quarter in between his fingers with the other hand. Something he did a lot when he was alive. He turned his head and saw me frozen, staring at him. The expression on his face was new, I would never forget. His eyes got huge and he kind of tilted his head forward, with the expression like, "You can see me?" I don't know how long we stared at each for, but I turned away when I started to hear my cat ripping up the ducking carpet again in the other room. When I turned back to my ex, he was gone. It's worth noting that he had only been dead for a couple months too. Some Romanian women I worked with told me that the dead stick around for 3 months before crossing over. I don't know about all that, but I know without a shadow of a doubt, what I saw that day. When I was between the ages of 4 to 6, I used to see a little blonde boy through this mirrored armoire in my parents' bedroom. The armoire was big and wooden, but had mirrored accents and mirrors running all the way around the base. If I laid on the carpet in front of it and looked into the mirrors on the bottom, sometimes I'd see a little blonde boy in a red sweater in the corner of the room, far away and a little distorted but still very clear. He would sit with his back to me, looking out the windows to the backyard. I don't remember ever seeing his face. I don't think I saw him many times, but I do remember his image very clearly. In my little kid mind, I thought I invented this super neat mirror trick by myself, so I tried to get my parents to see it too. They always refused, and my mom especially would get super mad at me for asking. I stopped seeing the boy when I stopped playing in their bedroom as much, and knew mirrors shouldn't work like that. When I got older, I chalked it up to my overactive kid brain. Didn't think much of it, tbh. Years and years later, when I was an adult and long after my parents had sold that house, my mom asked me about the armoire out of the blue, then told me that she used to see the little boy too. Not in the mirrors, but sometimes just out the corners of her eyes, like she'd be cooking and catch a glimpse of blonde hair pass by her hips, at a kid's height, and occasionally in dreams. It didn't happen too often, but just enough to deeply freak them out. So when I mentioned seeing the same little boy, my mom was just terrified herself. There were other strange stuff in that house, but this was 100% the most vivid I remember. I worked for an online retailer warehouse for a few months. There were 2 depressing windows that obviously were the bare minimum required for zoning that I probably walked by 1,000 times a day. Outside you'd see a concrete retaining wall, and some trucks. Obviously after a while I'd barely see out of my periphery, wall trucks, wall. Until one day I saw trucks, and then in the second window, pigs. It was only a second, but I definitely saw a bunch of massive pigs in fenced-in areas, with a rolling hills beyond. Of course, when I looked back, no pigs. For the next few weeks I stared out the windows when I went past, always seeing nothing but that wall. It was only when I got lazy and stopped paying attention that it happened again. Pigs, hill, then look back and gone. Apparently the land used to be a farm, never found out if it was a pig farm. I like to think it's a flash of the past and not the ghosts of bacon. In 2018, my grandpa was in the hospital due to being in a very bad diabetic state. No one wanted to say it, but he was close to the end of his life. My sister and a few cousins flew out to see him, and he was getting worse. I wanted to go, but I couldn't due to money, and it was killing me because him and I were extremely close. He ends up passing away a couple weeks later, and when my grandma called, she said he kept asking for me and my mom before he passed, and that crushed me. I wanted to say my finally goodbyes. I loved that man so much. Then one night I had an extremely vivid dream, that I was at the beautiful ranch in Mexico, and I walked through the gates, and saw this long house with many cars outside. I went in and opened the door, and I was greeted by my aunt. I have her a hug, and turned to look who was all there, and sitting right in the corner was my grandpa smiling. He stood up, and I ran to him and have him the biggest hug. I woke up right after, and cried tears of joy/sadness. It felt so real. I used to do pest control. Went to a customer's business for the first time. As I walked in the office I noticed some pictures that were supposed to be hanging on the wall were on the ground, and then saw some papers which looked like they had been thrown and scattered off a desk. I picked everything up so I could apply treatment to the floorboards and surrounding rooms. I then went to treat the only restroom in the office. I simply knocked on the door as a courtesy, as I always do before entering any restroom. There was no reply, for nobody was in there, so I went and applied treatment to the restroom, and I closed the door behind me. As I walked away from the door I know I heard somebody grab the door handle, twist it open and open the door. I turned around and looked to see nobody behind me but a door swinging open. The hair on my neck instantly stood up and I put two and two together. I grabbed my shit and ran downstairs. The receptionist saw me and started laughing. She asked me if I had met their little friend upstairs. My grandfather loved my grandmother a lot. He would constantly tell her she was beautiful and would always do embarrassing things to make her laugh. Unfortunately, she died a few months after being diagnosed with cancer. This affected him a lot, but as time went on he came to terms with it. My grandfather lived on for another 18 years. In his final years he developed really bad Alzheimer's that led him to forget that his wife had passed away, and would often call for her or ask us where she went. We'd explained to him that she had passed away, but it always made him distressed and upset, so we decided to tell him she'll be back soon every time he asked where she was. A month or so before my grandfather passed away, I was at his house with my mother and we were all sitting in the living room. My grandfather, who was seated on his chair, all of a sudden starts frantically asking us where my grandmother was. We calmly explained to him that she'll be back soon and she was just out doing some chores. Unlike most times, he was being persistent on wanting to see her. We explained to him again that she'll be back soon, but he kept getting more persistent. He started to frantically call for her. He screamed her name as loud as he could over and over again, until out of nowhere every single door and window in the room flung open all at once. Now we could say that it was just wind, but all the doors and windows in the house had secure locks and would stay locked at all times, since my grandfather would wander off or forget to lock his doors. All the doors and windows burst open, and at that same second my grandfather, who was facing the front door, says, "What took you so long? I've been waiting for you," with a smile. My mother and I didn't see the person my grandfather talked to, but I'm sure that he saw his wife. Not sure if this counts as supernatural, but here it goes. The summer after I graduated high school I got a job delivering pizza to help save money for college. I had a lot of run-ins with some pretty weird characters, but nothing like what happened this one night. It was a Friday night. We deliver pizzas until 3 a.m. Fridays and Saturdays. It was 2:45 a.m. and we were preparing to close when our manager said we got a call for a delivery at place almost 20 minutes away. Being the desperate for money teenager I was, I offered to do the delivery. This was before smartphones had GPS, so I used a Garmin. I plugged in the address and off I went. The Garmin took me deep into the backwoods of rural Texas. I finally arrived to my destination. The house looked like something in a horror movie. Big wooden 2-story house with no lights on. The first thing I noticed about the house was that the front door was wide open. I sat in my car for a few minutes debating on turning back and claiming no one was home. Something just didn't feel right. I needed the tip money, so I sucked it up and approached the house. When I got to the open front door I didn't enter. Instead I knocked. No one answered. I knocked again as loud as I could. No response. I finally got the courage to say something. "Pizza delivery. Anyone home?" There was a few seconds of silence until I heard a weird voice, "Upstairs." I walked in the house and could barely make out my surroundings because it was so dark. I make it to the bottom of the stairs and look up into the dark abyss. Again I said, "Pizza delivery." The voice spoke again, "Come upstairs." I can't get out of bed. Something was very off about this voice. It didn't sound normal. The best I can describe it is if a dog somehow learned to talk but still had trouble pronouncing human words. The hair stood up on my neck. There was no ducking way I was going up there. The tip wasn't worth it. I placed the pizza at the bottom of the stairs and shouted, "I'm leaving it here at the bottom of the stairs. Have a good night." As I turned away, the voice said, "No. Come upstairs." "I can't get out of bed." I replied, "I'm sorry, I'm not even allowed to enter someone's home on the job. You'll have to come get it." I heard some loud banging from upstairs with the voice shouting at full volume, "Come upstairs. I can't come out of bed." The voice shouted this over and over again like it was a recording on a loop. The banging got louder and louder as the voice got louder. I noped the duck out of there at full speed. To this day I have no idea what the duck happened in that house. I met a girl a long time ago. Like, close to 20 years ago. We hung out off and on, nothing significant really, just as friends, and told stories about our lives and other stupid shit. After a while, she told me a story about a house she used to live in a neighboring city. She told me about how she'd experienced the same thing, the same haunting every few nights. Her bedroom was upstairs, and the kitchen, dining room, a bathroom, and another bedroom were in the basement. Easiest way to access them was through the garage, that's how everyone came inside anyway. No one used the actual front door upstairs. Anyway, in the middle of the night, she'd hear someone enter through the garage and go into the kitchen. They were basically attached. The faucet would turn on and a bowl or something would crash in the sink. The water would stop. The footsteps would continue through the dining room and to the staircase. It was a mini spiral staircase that led to the living room. Her bedroom was attached to that. Then the footsteps would stop halfway up. It was only about 10 steps before the top, but she said they'd always stop at the same point. When she told me this, I panicked. I asked her the address. It was the same house I'd lived in as a kid 4 years before she did. And I experienced the same thing. Only I'd never told a single person about it. Not my parents, my brothers, my friends, no one. Yet she described it perfectly, step by step, room by room. That house was always weird, even before my own experience, but never have I had a shared haunting moment like that. This happened to me when I was around 19 and still living with my mom. It was the night before Three Kings Day. I was fast asleep in bed, when suddenly I woke up with the loud thought in my head screaming, "You're not alone." I was facing the wall and all my hair stood on end. I started hearing what sounded like clothes rustling, like someone was moving quietly in my room. I was scared shitless, but at that point it's like, God damn it, now I have to look, and when I did, Dios mío. I saw at the foot of my bed something that looked to be around 3 feet tall, wearing a white coat. I shat myself and did the only thing a 19-year-old brave woman can do. I hid under the covers and turned on the TV. When I looked again, it was gone. I called my then boyfriend to tell him what I saw. He laughed and said it was one of the three kings. Idiot. Next morning, I walked downstairs and my mom and stepdad are having breakfast. I told them what I saw and my mom just gave me the weirdest look as I told my story. When I was done, she just told my stepdad tell her about my dream, and he says, "What, were you dreamt with that exact same thing?" "Yeah, I shat myself a second time." She had a dream that same night where small white-robed creatures were trying to bother her, like little imps or something. What came in my room also went through my mother's dreams. When I was about 17, I went to go live with my dad. Had a cool teen pad in the basement. 0 windows, so it was pitch black with the lights off. One night I turn the lights off and go to bed. I feel something walk onto my mattress, futon on the floor. I thought nothing of it, so much so I just thought it was the dog, even though I don't recall her being there. Get up to let the dog out. No dog. Go to sleep. This proceeds to happen every ducking night for the next 7 months. Start sleeping with the lights on. Still I can feel and see the imprints on my bed of some creature walking onto my bed and hovering inches from my face. Dad is super religious, so I don't want to tell him for fear of him freaking out about the devil. Oversleep one day and wake up to an angry phone call from my dad lecturing me about being responsible. I'm sitting at the edge of my futon mattress. In front of me is another futon that actually has the frame that I kept on the couch position, my idea of cool as a kid. Across from that by about 3 feet is the closet that leads to the water heater. As my dad is yelling at me on the phone and I'm sitting there groggy, waking up, and angry, The door to the closet flies off the hinges with great force and slams into the arm of the wooden futon frame. I am so stunned I can't even scream, but I jump immediately. My dad on the phone hears the slam and proceeds to scream at me asking what the duck that was. I stammer and tell him the door fell off the hinges and hit the futon. I know he is going to be angry about the giant couch arm-sized hole that is now in the door. He answers, of course, with doors don't just fall off hinges. I am now grounded for destroying property and lying. Now the entity is more comfortable. It gets closer, stays longer, and doesn't wait till night time to come out. I am in my own personal grounded hell with this thing. I don't think it was too malicious because the end of the interactions is abrupt. One night it is on my bed, presumably staring at me. Again, I can see its imprint but can't actually see it. My go-to coping was to just pretend it wasn't happening. I just ignored it as best I could. One night it decided it didn't want to be ignored anymore and physically grabbed my arm and yanked it up. I ran as fast as I could out of that room. It then followed me up the stairs, could clearly hear the footsteps. It was the middle of the night. My dad was sleeping on the living room couch. I squeezed in next to him thinking if it tried to actually hurt me I could scream and my dad would wake up. The creature got to the top of the stairs. It did not come near me. Instead its footsteps went into the kitchen where I heard a crash. My dad didn't wake up. I was terrified. After the crash, and realizing this thing can actually leave my ducking room, nothing ever happened again. It's almost like it felt bad for scaring me and just wanted to validate its existence or something. Still terrified me though. Flash forward to about 10 years later. I'm now an adult and on a road trip, just me and my dad. He is separated from his wife and has taken the room in the basement. He confides in me during this bonding time that he feels something walking across his bed at night. When I was a kid, I spent a lot of time at my grandma's house. Both of my parents worked long hours, so her place became like a second home. She was a tough old woman. Rail thin, but strong. Sometimes I'd watch her going about her routine and wonder if she was some kind of a witch. She just had a witchy way about her. But, of course, that might just be what resourcefulness looks like to a kid. Anyway, her house didn't help. It was old. Everything in it was old, and it was dark. I don't know how best to describe it other than to say I always felt that being inside my grandma's house wasn't much different from being outside of it. In any season the windows in the house would stay jammed open with old, bent screens, which had to be shimmed into place with old slats from some discarded louver door. Grandma had this rusty pot-belly stove right smack in the middle of her bedroom. I remember constantly dodging it as I ran through the house playing. At night, she'd load the stove with one great big chunk of hickory, and you could see the flames licking through the cracks. I'd lay on the floor with my sleeping bag, positioning myself so that the stove was in between me and Grandma's bed. Facing this direction meant that I could easily see the window at the foot of her bed. It was like a night light for me. Everything in that house was black at night, unless there was a window nearby. So, there I lay one night. It was chilly, and I remember having trouble sleeping because the moonlight coming through the window was so bright. It was late, which meant the stove wasn't roaring anymore. Besides my grandma's breathing, the whole house was dead silent. It was just the two of us. No one else was in the house. Without any warning, a tall black figure calmly walks from the shadows at the far side of the room. He passed between the stove and bed, across the floor just a foot from my head, and out through the doorway into the kitchen. I was petrified. Couldn't move an inch. This may sound crazy, but had I felt like a burglar was in the house, I'd like to think I would have moved. Or shouted, or something. I didn't think it was a burglar, though. No specific reason why. It just felt wrong. I don't think I fell asleep that night. All I remember is staring at the kitchen doorway, for a long, long time. When my grandma woke up, she rolled out of bed and grabbed the fire poker. I sat up and began to tell her what I'd saw. Like I said, I always felt like my grandma was a little bit witchy. After I finished telling her about the tall man, she just poked at the coals in the stove and said, haven't seen him in a long time. When I was 15, I woke up in the middle of the night and saw this strange spotlight appear on my wall. It was a circle made up of a bunch of bright circular dots within it. It came on strong, then rotated 90 degrees and then turned off. It was so surreal because the light was extremely bright and yet it was also focused on that one spot on my wall. When I woke up the next morning, I couldn't get the image out of my head, but I just assumed I must have dreamed it. My sister and I were talking over breakfast, and she said I had this dream last night. My entire room suddenly lit up with these circular dots floating around my room. I got really excited that actually happened. I woke up and saw it too. My sister froze. How is that possible? My blinds are completely shut. Chills. To this day. My house was built in the mid-1800s as a farmstead, and over the last 20 years that my family has occupied it, we've made various renovations to it. One thing we discovered while gutting the last unrenovated room in the house was that some of the struts and paneling was charred, as if there had been a particularly bad fire in that room. Later on, my brother told me that he had seen a pair of feet that looked burnt running through the house late at night a few years ago. I was incredulous, and ready to disbelieve him, when I realized that I had experienced something similar a long time ago. When I was a child around Christmas time, I decided to see if I could stay up and hide at the top of the stairs to catch a glimpse of Santa. At around 1 a.m., after I knew everyone was asleep, I crept to the staircase to see a pair of dark feet walk from the kitchen to the living room, in front of the bottom of the steps. My parents were definitely asleep, so I had assumed it was Santa and excitedly went to bed. Now, I'm not so sure it was, but rather something more in line with what my brother saw some years later. One time me and my husband was watching TV in our living room. He decided to kick his shoes off while sitting on the couch and both shoes landed in front of the TV stand, on the floor and on their sides. About 30 minutes into the TV show we were watching, one of his shoes out of the ducking blue moved upwards by itself. I froze up on the couch and out of the corner of my eye, I saw my husband staring at a shoe looking startled. Then I said to my husband, "Did you see that?" He replied, "Yay." My eyes started to get really huge, and he saw that I was about ready to flip out and he said, "It's okay. Calm down. I'll burn some cedar." So then he did and all felt well again. We're native so we just smudged that hoe out of our house. Dead of night, I get this uncontrollable urge to wake up and crawl to the edge of my bed and peek down the hallway into the kitchen. I can't explain it, but I literally felt possessed to do so. I was maybe 4 or 5. When I reached the edge of my bed and stared down the hallway, I saw a figure, a ghost. It was my uncle. He had recently died due to a tragic car accident. He had a broken leg, was crossing the street, a truck lost control, my uncle couldn't run fast enough with his broken leg so the truck ran him over. So anyway, I'm staring at this figure and I realize it's him. The ghost looked just like him, glasses and all. It didn't have legs, which made sense to me since he lost both of his legs due to the accident. But I remember I didn't feel scared at all. I was in a daze. I felt this warmth in my chest. It was so calming. We were just staring at each other. I know it was only for a few seconds, but it felt like a lifetime. After those few seconds it was almost as though he heard a loud noise. He jumped and scurried down the other end of the hallway. I snapped out of it and started to sweat profusely. I was shaking. I tried to tell my sister about it, but she told me I was scaring her. I wasn't even all that close to my uncle since I was so young. I still think of him in that moment often. This was mid-2000s. I was asleep in my room with my girlfriend at the time, at my mom's house. I was about 25? It was sometime after midnight and we were both startled awake by the sound of loud, angry voices, engaged in some kind of a fiery argument downstairs. Most of the discussion was impossible to hear save for occasional F-bomb or other swear words. It was intense, and we both looked at each other, in shock I believe. I truly thought our house was being burglarized. My mom was asleep down the hall and I didn't hear her stirring. I told my girlfriend to use my cell phone and call 911 if she heard me getting into it with whoever was in our home. I grabbed my pistol from my desk and tried to slink downstairs. The voices cut off as soon as I left my bedroom. The house was quiet as I banked a left turn to the top of the stairs. I listened for noises and heard nothing. I descended the stairs, cursing every loose floorboard in that old house. The moment I landed on the first floor, I began clearing the rooms and flicking lights on as I went. My heart was racing. I was sure that at any moment I would be face to face with the people I had heard moments before. But the entire house was empty. The TV was off, the DVD player as well. The front door remained locked and bolted. The motion lights had not been activated. All the windows were shut, making it less likely that the noise could have been coming from some sort of domestic disturbance in the neighborhood. There was just no way to rationalize what we heard. If it had just been me, I would have attributed it to one of my usual nightmares, as I'm a vet diagnosed with PTSD. But the fact that we both woke up, and we both heard it, made me feel a bit more uneasy. There is probably some very rational explanation, but I truly believe there was some dark energy at play in that house. My mother said she felt it on a number of occasions coming from the coat closet on the main floor. When she would reach for a coat, she felt like something wanted to shut her in there. My brother reportedly saw a phantom or ghost, not sure the difference, floating above him after he woke up in the afternoon. He's not the type to make that sort of stuff up, and he parted with the story very reluctantly. I believe everyone had an experience there. Weird. About a year ago, my coworker and I went to get coffee at a new coffee shop that opened up by our work. I was dealing with a lot of anxiety over my future. Anyway, while in line there was a woman in front of me. She was giving her order when she stopped mid-sentence and looks behind her to see me. She turns back around, gives the barista her order. After I give my order, she comes up to me and, "Hey, I know this is going to sound weird, but do you know a man named Jim?" Her words took me off guard because Jim was my grandpa. He died of cancer. He didn't live in the same state as I did, so I doubt he and this woman would have ever met him. I told her yes, he was my grandpa. And she told me that he wanted me to know that I needed to stop worrying because everything was going to be okay. Came crying in the middle of the coffee store in front of my bewildered coworker and a couple of strangers. 2 stories. I was 14 or 15, sitting in our downstairs living room while my parents slept in their bedroom upstairs. It was around 1 a.m. or so, and I was on the computer playing a video game. The only light in the house comes from my computer screen and a lamp that's opposite me, by the couch. Suddenly, I hear a man's voice say my name very plainly. Not a whisper, not a yell. Just a mid-level call that sounds like it's coming from the darkened hall. I assume it's my dad, because sometimes he comes down the stairs and calls at me from the lower step, to tell me to get to bed or whatever. I get up and go into the hallway, but no one's there. I look up the stairs, and call, lightly, to my dad, but then I hear his telltale snores from upstairs. A bit weirded out, I go back to the computer. A minute later, I hear the voice call say my name again, but this time it's as if the person speaking is right beside me, and the voice is a bit more assertive. I jump and look in the direction of the voice. Nothing is there. Suddenly, the lamp across the room starts to hum, the light flickers and the light bulb explodes. I got pretty unnerved at that point. I turned on all the downstairs lights, cleaned up the burst bulb, and went upstairs to sleep. 2nd story, I was about 8 or 9, and was getting ready for bed in my room. I was sitting on my bed and taking off my socks when I suddenly got this overwhelming feeling that I was being watched. I knew of the feeling, but had never experienced it myself. I felt for sure that something with bad intentions was standing over against the wall between my closet and my closed door, watching me. A feeling of terror washed over me and I sat there for what felt like an hour, probably just a few minutes, staring at the floor, unable to move, paralyzed with fear. Eventually I mustered up the courage to look up, reasoning that what I was feeling was silly. I knew that once I looked up and saw that nothing was there, the feeling would go away. It didn't. I looked up and felt even more terrified. Nothing was there, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I had locked eyes with some malevolent, invisible force. After another minute, frozen, unblinking, I stood and made my way slowly toward the presence. Trying to decide whether to bolt out the door, it was right beside it, or face it, I decided to approach it. Eventually, I felt as if I was face to face with whatever this thing was, and the feeling of a presence was as strong as ever. I raised my hand, paused, and then thrust it forward. I felt a bit surprised when my fist hit the wall. The feeling of being watched suddenly disappeared and I felt alone again. I never had that feeling ever again. This will probably be lost, but one night I was driving from North Dakota to Nebraska and I was passing through a section of South Dakota that sits between the Rosebud and Pine Ridge reservations. I was in the absolute middle of nowhere, no lights for miles, perfectly clear winter sky, amazing stars, and all of a sudden a meteor burns up in the sky above, turning the entire sky green for a few seconds. I stopped and just thought about how lucky I was to see that. As I keep driving, I come up to a small town where the only intersection is a 4-way stop in the middle of town. I assumed it was a ghost town because there are no lights of any kind. But as I came to stop, my car lights lit up the area around me and people were just walking around in the dark, acting like it was normal. It's the middle of the night, maybe 10 or 20 degrees max. Needless to say, I didn't stop again until I got to town with street lamps. I think those areas are a little more wild, or spiritual. Wounded Knee was near there, and that part of the US had terrible atrocities commuted against the natives. I think it left its mark on that place. I live in a small village in Louisiana. Most women I know have had supernatural experiences of varying degrees. My mom's mom, saw a ghost boy in her family home. My great aunt, Mama's sister, heard God's voice at a cemetery, warning her to stay in her car. My mom heard the disembodied voice of a little girl giggling and yelling "Mama" in Mama's family home. Those are all pretty par for the course. Could easily be explained away by them mishearing things, or having a brief hallucination. For me, it was a little more substantial. I have crazy vivid dreams. The kind that have so much detail in them, that my more superstitious friends and family believe they aren't dreams at all. Just glimpses into potential past lives. However, they've always just been dreams to me. Sure, They were realistic in ways they shouldn't have been, but dream science is weird. Then, when I was 12, I had a dream that came true. Like I said earlier, I live in Louisiana. We have lots of storms, especially in the spring and summer. One day, in that weird week when it's too warm to be spring but not humid enough to be summer, there was a huge thunderstorm. I fell asleep on the couch listening to it. I dreamed that a tornado happened near Mama's family home. The tornado wrecked her rose bushes, tore down her willow tree, and ripped off shingles in a specific part of the roof. The next thing I know, my mom is standing over me and rushing me to get dressed. She says Mama's house was hit by a tornado. We drive to her place, and the yard looks exactly like it did in my dream. Same wrecked rose bushes, same torn up willow tree, and in the exact spot in my dream, missing shingles. I told Mom and Mama what I had dreamed, and that's when they told me about the weird things that happened to the women in our family. Always been a skeptic for paranormal stuff, but here's my one experience. I was at a summer camp when I was 15. There was a ghost story told every year I went that was the same story. I'll give the Cliff Notes version. Woman and husband on honeymoon at resort once built on the land the camp is on today. Resort burned down with husband inside as they were getting ready to have pictures taken in wedding gown and tuxedo. Woman vanished without a trace. Search party found her 2 months later, asking if someone could help her find her husband. A group of paramedics go with her, she was still in the dress, to find her husband. Nobody returns. Some people say that you can see her every night of the full moon and new moon as a floating orb of light on the water of the lake. If she comes to shore and near you, act asleep or she'll make you come with her to find her husband. It's a new moon, the first night we're there. We sleep in Adirondacks, which are 3-walled cabins with a roof. One wall is open to the air, and for maintenance's sake, open downhill, facing the lake so they can be pressure washed and the runoff drains to the lake. When I worked there, we used water, so there were no pollutants used when cleaning. I slept on the outside edge nearest the opening because I brought a cot to sleep on and it made the best sense space-wise. I'm laying there, falling asleep in the pitch black, and a light just slowly gets brighter. I think it's a counselor coming over to make sure we're falling asleep, so I peek with my eyes mostly closed. It's the floating orb of light from the story on the lake, as bright during a car's headlights. It's just slowly and silently floating across the lake, towards me. I'm just frozen, because what the hell do I do against that? I can see it from through my eyelids because it's that bright. I peek again, and it's probably 4 feet away from me. Absolutely paralyzing. It keeps going uphill, and I watch the light shift as it passed the staff cabins first, then through the trees. Needless to say, I was awake until I heard the birds start waking up and move to the back corner of the Adirondack the next night, forfeiting the cot's location. Here's the rub, I didn't even know about the story until 4 nights after the fact when we went on a night hike. My brain started going into overtime to connect the dots. It made going back as a staff member an interesting experience. I have a lot of stories about the first house I lived on. This is one of them. My youngest sister at the age of 3 or 4 made an imaginary friend. She will describe her as a blonde long-haired girl with a funny long pajama. My sister will play hours by herself and her imaginary friend when my parents will leave. So babysitting her was super easy. One night my sister comes to me and tells how excited she is because her friend finally revealed her name, don't remember her name, and how she died. At her age, my sister didn't know anything about death. My sister goes on and tells me how her friend used to live in this building, ran out to the street without looking one time and a lot of horses stepped on her. I was beyond terrified and couldn't sleep a bit that entire night. 8 years later, my family moved to a bigger house. A few months into the new house, my cousin phones my parents to ask if she could use the first floor of the old house to do a big sleepover for her birthday. I was invited because my cousin and I were friends. Before people start showing up to the sleepover, my cousin asks me not to tell any scary story about the place because she wanted everyone to stay. I of course agreed. A lot of people I didn't know arrived. These were my cousin's new friends from high school and one of them was extremely interested in going upstairs. She wouldn't say why but after an hour or so lost interest. Out of the blue the friend approaches me and tells me there is a girl upstairs excited to see me again. I panicked and went to my cousin to ask her if she decided to tell the scary stories. My cousin says no, so we asked her friend not to tell anyone else. 30 minutes later, the same friend approaches me and tells me the girl is extremely excited to see all these girls and she is at the bottom of the stairs. I was okay with that part of her sentence but not with what followed. But the man who takes care of all the children is telling her to go upstairs with them. My whole life living there I thought only this ghost girl existed in that place. When my husband and I first moved in together, we adopted a cat. He was a mean old bugger, 9 when we got him. He didn't like to be pet or cuddled and would nip you if you tried. He'd been declawed young and had learned how to defend himself without the claws. If you pissed him off he would go away, wait till you'd forgotten all about him and then he'd strike. In, bite, out. He was a ninja cat of the best quality. He was a 15 pounds cat. We tried not to piss him off. He didn't purr until we'd had him for almost 2 years, and by then he had turned into a real pet. Only with us would he snuggle and purr, and he became our constant bedtime companion. His practice was to wait till we were comfy, then he would jump up at the foot of the bed, thump, and walk up the middle between us till he was level with our butts, pit-pat, pit-pat. Then he'd just fall on his side against my husband, thump, knocking him a couple more inches away from me. We got so used to it that, on our honeymoon, we found ourselves laying awake wondering what it was that kept us awake, as if waiting for something before we could sleep. We realized that we missed his nightly routine. During his 3rd year with us, he got out and was cornered by the neighbor's dog, who picked our munchkin up in his mouth and shook him. We rushed him to the vet, but the vet said that the bite had pierced his bowel and small intestine. At that age, he wasn't even to be considered for surgery, the risk of infection being so high and the possibility of dying while under anesthesia equally so. We gave him peace that night and went home with heavy hearts. It was probably a week or so after that evening, when my husband and I got into bed, that he came to us. I think it was just him, maybe thanking us for giving a crotchety old Cuda-loving home, but certainly telling us that he'd moved on. You see, just as we started to nod off, we were awoken by thump, pit-pat, pit-pat. I was waiting for that final thump when I remembered that he was no longer with us. I asked my husband, was that what I think it was? My husband, a complete non-believer, I might add, said, I think so. That was Munchie, wasn't it? I guess so. I can't think what else it could possibly be. Over the years, my husband's memory has faded enough for him to question if it really happened. He doesn't really want to believe. But I do. And I won't forget. I know who's waiting at the Rainbow Bridge. So I've never believed in ghosts or anything, but once I did live in this apartment that would always creep me out at nighttime. Most of the time I would just get a weird vibe from the place, but one night. Around 1:30 a.m. I went into the bathroom to brush my teeth before bed. As I'm brushing I hear 2 knocks at the door. I was in my kids' bathroom, so I figured it was just one of them having to use the restroom. I told them to come in and continued brushing. Looking in the mirror over the sink I could see the door behind me. I watched the doorknob do a quarter turn and then the door opened just a bit. But no one came in. My kids were young and it was the middle of the night, so I figured it was just one of them being sleepy. I opened the door expecting to find a child, but there was no one there. And then I heard it in my heart about jumped put of my chest. Breathing. Small rhythmic breaths. My kids were asleep across the hall. All 3 of them, in their beds. I ran down the hall to the master bedroom and saw my wife laying there, sleeping. I was alone and someone or something had definitely knocked on the bathroom door. And I had definitely invited it. And it definitely entered. We moved out a few weeks later. My sister and I used to hang out in her room before going to bed as kids, and our mom always heard us talking to someone we called Theo every evening for hours. One time she asked us who Theo was and we said it was the man under my sister's bed. At some point my sister got really scared of him and refused to sleep in her own bed. My mom believed us and thought it was a ghost, and said that my sister should just ask him to leave. She did, and we never talked to Theo again. My old friend growing up moved into a home down the street from me. It was a brick house built in the 1940s. He sent me tons pictures of the inside, his room, hallways, the basement, etc. Turns out the house used to be a funeral home. After weeks of only talking sporadically, my friend was not the same. He began telling me that he was seeing and hearing things in the house. Only then did I go back to look at the pictures he sent. There was one specific photo that stood out to me and still does to this day. Very faintly I could make out a young girl in a dress and pigtails, who stood at the bottom of the stairs. Him and his family would continue to see her for the rest of the time that they lived there. I wasn't skeptical per se, but the activity he explained sounded almost unnecessarily heavy. I decided to go over one day to see how he was doing because he had become reclusive and skittish. I was sitting in his room, which was a half-finished attic. The other half that wasn't finished was blocked off by a wooden door. I still can't explain what came over me. It honestly felt like I was drugged as I sat on his couch. I hadn't consumed anything, I could barely look up, my entire head became tight and my vision was blurred. I felt like I was being watched by something dark over by that door. I told him I was tired and that I should probably head home. I was surprised I made it down the stairs. As soon as I left that place it felt like 100 pounds were lifted from my shoulders. I never went back and my friend is still haunted by that house, as am I. I actually got back in touch with him a few months ago to ask him about it and he sent this. How could I forget the time I had a dream about ripping up the floorboards with my hands to get to the basement from my room downstairs. Then when I moved upstairs I noticed a hole in my floor under my bed where I was dreaming of digging at, which was right on top of the boarded off room in the basement. His sister also experienced scratching noises, voices outside the door, and bad smells. Their cats were anxious and unlike themselves, the door upstairs swung so much it had to be taped down. Yeah, safe to say never going back there again. Or maybe I will. Who knows?